a homeless millionaire saved a desperate family and reclaimed a life he lost. The crisp morning air bites through the worn fabric of his once expensive coat as Jacob Anderson straightens the collar, a habitual gesture from his corporate days. Despite living on the streets, his dignified bearing catches the eye of passers-by. Some recognize a ghost of refinement in his weathered features, making them do a double take at the homeless man who carries himself like a CEO. At the local soup kitchen, he helps organize the line, offering guidance to newcomers with the same authoritative kindness he once used in board meetings. A volunteer whispers to another, "Did you know he used to be worth 50 million? Owned that big glass building downtown." The other volunteer scoffs, "Yeah, right. And I'm the Queen of England." But they're both watching as Jacob gently guides a young mother and her 2 children to the front of the line, his refined manners a stark contrast to his shabby appearance. It's been exactly 1,000 days since he lost everything: his fortune, his reputation, his family. Yet somehow he's about to discover that his greatest legacy won't be built with money, but with the very thing that destroyed him: trust. This is the story of a man who had to lose everything to find what truly matters, and how saving one family might just help him save himself. Before you continue watching this touching story about redemption and second chances, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to like if this resonates with you. Jacob Anderson's story began in the manufacturing district of Detroit, where ambition and innovation intersected with old-world craftsmanship. Born to middle-class parents, his father a factory foreman and his mother a schoolteacher, Jacob learned early the value of both hard work and education. Unlike many success stories of inherited wealth, his rise to prominence came through a combination of relentless determination and an uncanny ability to see opportunities others missed. At 23, fresh out of business school, he mortgaged everything his parents owned to buy a failing automotive parts supplier. Working 18-hour days, sleeping on the factory floor, and personally visiting every potential client, he transformed the company into Anderson Technologies. His innovation wasn't just in manufacturing, it was in how he treated people. While other CEOs cut benefits during the economic downturn, Jacob introduced profit sharing, educational programs, and comprehensive healthcare for all employees. By 35, Anderson Technologies had become a billion-dollar corporation, employing over 10,000 people across the country. Jacob's reputation for ethical business practices and employee welfare made him a darling of both Wall Street and Main Street. He married Catherine, a brilliant environmental lawyer, and they had 2 children. Their mansion in Grosse Pointe became known not for its luxury, but for hosting charitable events that raised millions for education and homeless shelters. The media loved his story, the local boy who made good but never forgot his roots. Every Christmas, he personally served meals at soup kitchens. Every summer, he funded scholarships for underprivileged students. His corporate headquarters included a free daycare center and technical training facility. Employees didn't just work for Anderson Technologies, they were part of what the press called the Anderson family. Jacob's philosophy was simple: success meant nothing if it didn't lift others up with you. He regularly turned down more profitable ventures if they meant laying off workers. When other companies outsourced jobs, he invested in retraining programs. His board members often complained about his excessive employee benefits, but they couldn't argue with the results. Anderson Technologies had the highest productivity rates and lowest turnover in the industry. This commitment to ethical business earned him enemies among his peers. Other CEOs called him a bleeding heart who was ruining the market with his generous wages and benefits. But Jacob stood firm, often saying the best investment you can make is in people. His annual shareholder meetings became famous for his passionate defenses of stakeholder capitalism, the belief that companies had obligations not just to shareholders but to employees, communities, and society at large. The pinnacle of his success came with the opening of the Anderson Innovation Center, a state-of-the-art research facility dedicated to developing environmentally sustainable manufacturing processes. The center employed hundreds of scientists and engineers, all working toward making industry cleaner and more efficient. It was at the opening ceremony, standing beside his wife and children, that Jacob felt he'd finally achieved his life's purpose, creating success that truly benefited everyone. Looking back, he would later realize that this moment of triumph was also the beginning of his downfall. His visibility had made him a target, and his trust in people, the very quality that had built his empire, would soon be used against him. But standing there that day, watching his dream become reality, Jacob Anderson was the embodiment of the American dream, proof that one could achieve tremendous success while maintaining their humanity and lifting others up along the way. What he didn't know was that within 18 months, every piece of this carefully built life would be systematically destroyed, not by market forces or bad decisions, but by a calculated betrayal that would test not just his resilience, but his very belief in human goodness. The first cracks in Jacob's empire appeared subtly, like hairline fractures in a seemingly solid foundation. Richard Sterling, his newly appointed chief financial officer, came highly recommended by Marcus Hayes, a prominent state official who oversaw manufacturing regulations. Sterling had a reputation for aggressive growth strategies, and initially his innovative financial approaches seemed to be taking Anderson Technologies to new heights. Within months of Sterling's arrival, the company's stock price soared. New contracts poured in, many through connections with Hayes's office. Jacob, focused on expanding the Innovation Center's environmental research, trusted Sterling to manage the financial details. This trust, born from years of successful delegation and belief in people's inherent goodness, would prove to be his undoing. The first warning came from Martha Chen, a long-time accountant who'd been with the company since its early days. She noticed discrepancies in the books, subtle irregularities that didn't quite add up. When she brought her concerns to Jacob, Sterling smoothly explained them away as necessary complexities of their new growth strategy. Jacob, remembering Hayes's strong recommendation, accepted the explanation. Martha resigned the next week, leaving a letter that Jacob, overwhelmed with other responsibilities, never read. The scheme revealed itself piece by piece. Sterling had been orchestrating an elaborate fraud, using Anderson Technologies' stellar reputation to secure government contracts through Hayes's office. Inflated costs, phantom subcontractors, and kickbacks had created a web of corruption that had been growing right under Jacob's nose. By the time federal investigators started asking questions, the damage was already severe. What followed was a masterclass in character assassination. Sterling, working with Hayes, had carefully documented meetings and decisions in a way that implicated Jacob while protecting themselves. Emails were selectively leaked, conversations were taken out of context, and suddenly the media's favorite ethical businessman became the face of corporate corruption. The betrayal cut deeper than just business. Sterling had cultivated friendships with board members, subtly undermining their confidence in Jacob's leadership. Hayes used his political connections to expedite investigations and freeze company assets. Even Catherine began to question whether she truly knew her husband, as evidence seemed to mount that their comfortable life had been built on fraud. The fall was swift and calculated. Within weeks, Jacob found himself facing federal charges. The board, led by members loyal to Sterling, voted to remove him as CEO. The Innovation Center's funding was cut, its research dismissed as a vanity project. Employees who had once proudly called themselves part of the Anderson family now avoided eye contact in courthouse hallways. Perhaps most painfully, the media that had once celebrated his ethical approach now painted him as a hypocrite of the highest order. Headlines screamed about the fall of the People's CEO and Anderson's house of cards. His children faced bullying at school, his wife's law practice suffered, and former friends suddenly became unavailable. Throughout the ordeal, Jacob maintained his innocence, but Sterling had crafted the deception too well. Every attempt to expose the truth only seemed to entangle Jacob further. When he tried to reveal Sterling's connections to Hayes, he was accused of attempting to deflect blame onto respected public servants. His own detailed record-keeping was used against him, with documents selectively presented to support the prosecution's narrative. As his legal fees mounted and his assets were frozen, Jacob made a decision that would alter the course of his life. Rather than fight a battle that seemed increasingly unwinnable, he would take full responsibility not because he was guilty, but because continuing the fight would destroy the lives of thousands of employees who depended on the company's stability. In a move that shocked both prosecutors and his own lawyers, he pleaded guilty to reduced charges, accepting personal liability while protecting the company's future. The cost was everything he had built: his company, his reputation, his fortune, and ultimately his family. Catherine, unable to reconcile the man she loved with the evidence presented, filed for divorce. His children, following their mother's lead, cut off contact. Within a year of Sterling's appointment, Jacob Anderson, the ethical businessman, the philanthropist, the believer in human goodness, lost not just his wealth, but his entire identity. What no one knew then was that Detective Sarah Thompson of the Financial Crimes Division had noticed inconsistencies in the case. But by the time she began pulling at the threads of Sterling and Hayes' deception, Jacob had already disappeared into the anonymity of the streets, carrying with him a truth that would take years to come to light. 3 years after his fall from grace, Jacob Anderson's daily routine bore little resemblance to his former life. Dawn found him carefully organizing his few possessions in an abandoned warehouse near the River District. Despite his circumstances, he maintained a strict schedule, a remnant of his corporate days that helped preserve his sanity. Every morning he would wash in the public restroom of a nearby park, meticulously trimming his beard and straightening his salvaged clothes, refusing to surrender his dignity to homelessness. The locals in the area knew him as Professor, a nickname earned from his habit of helping homeless youth with job applications and basic financial advice. Few connected him to the disgraced CEO whose downfall had made headlines years ago. Those who did recognize him often found it hard to reconcile the media's portrayal of a corrupt businessman with the gentle, articulate man who spent his days helping others navigate the social services system. In the soup kitchens and shelters where he now spent much of his time, Jacob discovered a different kind of wealth, the wealth of human resilience. He saw former doctors, teachers, and executives who had lost everything to medical bills or mental health struggles. Their stories echoed his own, teaching him that the line between success and destitution was far thinner than most people realized. What set Jacob apart from many others on the streets was his unwavering maintenance of professional habits. He kept a small notebook, documenting the schedules of food banks and free clinics, sharing this information with others in need. His organizational skills, once used to run a billion-dollar corporation, now helped coordinate informal support networks among the homeless community. During the day, he would walk the city streets that he once drove through in a luxury car, observing how his former world operated from this new vantage point. He noticed how people's eyes slid past him, how security guards tensed when he entered public buildings, how former business associates would cross the street to avoid recognition. These experiences taught him more about human nature than his years in corporate boardrooms ever had. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort or the lack of resources, it was maintaining his belief in human goodness despite everything he'd lost. Some nights, lying on his makeshift bed, he would replay the events that led to his downfall, searching for where he could have acted differently. But increasingly, he found himself focusing not on what he'd lost, but on what he'd learned about the true nature of wealth and poverty. Most days he avoided his old haunts, but occasionally he would stand across from the Anderson Technologies building, watching employees enter and exit. Under Sterling's leadership, the company had grown even larger, though rumors of questionable practices occasionally surfaced. Jacob noticed how the free daycare center had been converted to executive parking, how the technical training facility now housed a premium gym for upper management. His presence on the streets had taught him to be invisible when necessary and commanding when required. He learned to navigate the complex social hierarchies of homelessness, using his experience in corporate diplomacy to mediate disputes and organize resources. The skills that had once made him a successful CEO now served to protect vulnerable members of the homeless community from exploitation. Despite everything, Jacob maintained his practice of daily reading, frequenting the public library where sympathetic staff allowed him longer stays during harsh weather. He kept up with business news, following the careers of those who had betrayed him with a detached interest. Sometimes he would help other homeless individuals write appeals for benefits or job applications, his business acumen finding new purpose in these small acts of assistance. What sustained him through these years wasn't hope for redemption or dreams of reclaiming his former life, it was the daily opportunity to help others despite his own circumstances. The man who once measured success in millions now found meaning in making life slightly easier for those society had forgotten. His fall from corporate heights had taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the ability to maintain one's humanity in the face of adversity. Unknown to Jacob, his quiet acts of kindness were being noticed, not by the media or the business world, but by those whose lives he touched, including a dedicated detective who had never stopped believing in his innocence, and a young family whose encounter with him would set in motion events that would shake the foundations of his carefully constructed world of survival. The December wind cut through the financial district like a knife, sending papers and debris skittering across empty streets. Jacob pulled his threadbare coat tighter, scanning the park for a sheltered spot to spend the night. That's when he heard a soft, muffled sob coming from behind the community center's dumpster. His instincts, honed by years on the street, told him to walk away. Getting involved usually meant trouble. Yet something in that sound pulled at him, echoing with a familiar desperation. What he found there would change everything. A young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, huddled with two small children under a thin blanket. The kids, a boy around 7 and a girl no more than 5, pressed against their mother for warmth. Their clothes, though worn, spoke of recent stability. These weren't veteran street survivors. The woman's face bore the shocked, disoriented look Jacob had seen too often, the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe where they had ended up. "The shelters are full," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. "They said to come back tomorrow." The children stared at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Jacob noticed the boy's protective arm around his sister, the mother's trembling hands, the single backpack that presumably contained everything they now owned. The scene struck him with devastating familiarity. He'd seen countless families like this in his corporate days when he served meals at shelters. Now he was one of them. Against his usual caution, Jacob crouched down to their level. "I'm Jacob," he said softly, maintaining a respectful distance. "There's a church 3 blocks from here that opens its basement on cold nights. They don't advertise it officially, but I know the caretaker." The woman's eyes flickered with hope, then suspicion. Jacob understood street survival meant being wary of strangers, even helpful ones. The little girl coughed, a harsh sound that spoke of developing cold. Jacob reached into his bag and pulled out his prized possession, a clean, warm blanket he'd received from a church donation. "Take this," he said, holding it out. "It's clean." The mother hesitated, pride warring with necessity. The boy spoke up, his voice stronger than expected. "Why are you helping us?" That simple question hit Jacob like a physical blow. In his former life, no one had questioned his motivations for helping others. It had been expected, even celebrated. Now, kindness was met with suspicion. "Because someone once helped me," he replied, though it wasn't entirely true. No one had been there when he first hit the streets. "And because it's cold." The woman finally introduced herself as Emily Carter. Her story came out in halting fragments: a job lost to company downsizing, savings drained by medical bills, an apartment eviction notice. Each detail resonated with the stories Jacob had heard countless times, both in his corporate boardrooms and on the streets. But something about Emily's quiet dignity, her fierce protection of her children, struck a deeper chord. Looking at them, Jacob saw reflections of his own lost family, the children he no longer had contact with, the life he'd been forced to abandon. The boy, Michael, had the same determined set to his jaw that Jacob's son had shown at that age. The girl, Sarah, clutched a worn mathematics workbook, reminding him painfully of his daughter's love for numbers. In that moment, Jacob made a decision that went against every survival instinct he'd developed on the streets. "Let me help you get to the church," he offered. "I know these streets at night. It's safer if you have a guide." He saw Emily's hesitation, the mental calculation of risk versus necessity. Finally, she nodded, gathering their meager belongings. As they walked through the darkened streets, Jacob found himself automatically shifting into his old role, the confident leader, the problem solver. He pointed out landmarks, spoke of safe routes and places to avoid, shared knowledge accumulated through hard experience. The children gradually moved closer, drawn by his calm authority. Emily watched him with growing curiosity, clearly sensing there was more to this homeless man than appeared on the surface. What Jacob didn't realize was that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change their lives, but would eventually expose the truth he had buried beneath years of survival. But in helping this family, he was unknowingly taking the first step toward reclaiming not just his lost identity, but something far more valuable: his belief in the possibility of justice. The next morning, as dawn broke over the city skyline, Jacob found himself still at the church basement, having spent the night watching over Emily and her children. During the quiet hours, Emily's story emerged in more detail, each revelation striking uncomfortably close to home. She had been an executive assistant at Carter Mills Manufacturing, a subsidiary that Anderson Technologies had once considered acquiring before Jacob's downfall. "It was a good job," Emily explained, her voice tinged with resignation. "Then the new management came in, these consultants who talked about streamlining and efficiency. Within months, half the staff was gone." Jacob felt a familiar twist in his gut, recognizing Sterling's signature business approach. The same practices he had once fought against were still destroying lives, long after his departure from the corporate world. Sarah, the younger child, had severe asthma, and the medical bills had quickly drained Emily's savings. The company's new insurance policy, restructured under the efficiency measures, covered less while demanding higher premiums. When Emily tried to fight for better coverage, citing previous commitments to employees, she was quietly moved to a part-time position, losing her benefits entirely. Michael, the older child, sat close to Jacob, hanging on every word as he shared practical advice about surviving on the streets. Mom used to read us stories about nights the boy said unexpectedly. They protected people who needed help. "Are you like that?" The question caught Jacob off guard, memories of his own children's bedtime stories flooding back. Before he could answer, Emily interjected softly, "He is, sweetheart. Just a different kind of night." As morning progressed, Jacob began making calls from the church's office phone, reaching out to contacts he still maintained among the city's social services. Years of homelessness had taught him which organizations were truly helpful and which merely provided bureaucratic runarounds. He knew which shelters had family units available, which food banks offered the best supplies, which medical clinics might help with Sarah's asthma. Emily watched him work with growing amazement. His manner, his speech, the way he negotiated with officials, none of it fit the stereotype of a homeless man. When she finally asked about his past, Jacob provided only the barest details. "I used to work in business," he said simply. Things changed, but Emily, trained by years of administrative work to read people, sensed there was much more to his story. The children's presence stirred something in Jacob that he'd thought long buried. Sarah's careful organization of her few remaining possessions reminded him painfully of his daughter's meticulousness. Michael's protective instincts toward his sister mirrored his own son's behavior at that age. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking of his family not with bitterness, but with a bittersweet mixture of love and regret. Through his contacts, Jacob managed to secure Emily an interview at a local non-profit organization. Using the church's computer, he helped her update her resume, drawing on his years of business experience to highlight her skills. As they worked, Emily shared more about her father, who had worked in manufacturing all his life before passing away a few years ago. He always said integrity mattered more than profits, she remembered. Not many people think that way anymore. The irony of her words wasn't lost on Jacob. He had built his company on exactly those principles, only to be destroyed by those who saw them as weaknesses to be exploited. Watching Emily with her children, he saw the same determination to maintain dignity despite circumstances, the same refusal to let hardship corrupt their values. By afternoon, Jacob had helped the family secure a temporary place at a family shelter, arranged medical assistance for Sarah's asthma, and set up job interviews for Emily. As they prepared to leave the church, Emily turned to him with tears in her eyes. "Why are you doing all this for us? You don't even know us." Jacob looked at the children, then back at her. "Because someone needs to," he said simply. "Because it's right." What he couldn't tell her was how helping them had awakened something he thought he'd lost forever, a sense of purpose, of being able to make a difference. As he watched them walk toward their new temporary home, Jacob felt a familiar stirring of the leadership instincts he'd suppressed for years. He didn't know it yet, but this family would become the catalyst for his own redemption, leading him back into a world he'd left behind, but this time with a deeper understanding of both success and failure. Over the next few weeks, Jacob found himself increasingly involved in Emily and her children's lives. He established a routine, meeting them at the shelter each morning to help Emily prepare for job interviews while the kids were at school. His business acumen, though hidden beneath years of street survival, emerged naturally as he coached her through interview techniques and workplace scenarios. The shelter staff initially viewed Jacob with suspicion. A homeless man spending time with a vulnerable family raised red flags. But Emily's fierce defense of him, combined with the obvious improvements in their situation, gradually won them over. Sister Margaret, the shelter's director, began to notice something unusual about their unlikely mentor. "He speaks like an educated man," she commented to Emily one evening. "And he knows things about business, about the system that most people on the streets don't." Jacob's guidance proved invaluable. He helped Emily navigate the complexities of social services, drawing on both his corporate experience and street knowledge. When she faced discrimination during job interviews due to her homeless status, he taught her how to present her situation in terms of resilience rather than desperation. His corporate negotiation skills, repurposed for this new context, helped her secure better terms for temporary housing and medical care. The children, particularly Michael, flourished under Jacob's influence. During afternoon homework sessions at the public library, Jacob discovered the boy had a natural aptitude for mathematics. Drawing on memories of teaching his own son, he began incorporating real-world examples into their lessons. Sarah, though quieter, would sit for hours listening to Jacob's stories, carefully illustrated in her worn notebook. One afternoon, while helping Sarah with her reading, Jacob noticed Emily watching them with an unreadable expression. "You had children once, didn't you?" she asked softly. The question caught him off guard, stirring memories he usually kept buried. After a long pause, he nodded. "They're grown now, we don't speak anymore." The pain in his voice made Emily reach out instinctively, but Jacob had already turned away, focusing intently on Sarah's workbook. Their presence in his life began to change Jacob in subtle ways. He started taking better care of himself, ensuring he was clean and presentable for their meetings. He found purpose in their daily interactions, a reason to maintain the professional standards he'd once lived by. Other shelter residents began seeking his advice, drawn by the visible success of his guidance with Emily's family. The transformation wasn't lost on Sister Margaret. She observed how Jacob's influence extended beyond just Emily's family to impact the entire shelter community. When other residents needed help with job applications or benefit forms, Jacob was there. When families struggled with budgeting their limited resources, he offered practical solutions drawn from both his corporate and street experience. But this increasing visibility carried risks. One evening, while helping at a shelter dinner, Jacob spotted a familiar face, a former board member from Anderson Technologies. He quickly retreated to the kitchen, heart pounding. The incident reminded him that his past was never far behind, that the comfortable routine he'd established with Emily's family balanced on a knife's edge of discovery. Despite these fears, Jacob couldn't bring himself to step away. The children had awakened something in him that had been dormant since his fall, a sense of responsibility, of being needed. When Michael proudly showed him an A on his math test, or when Sarah finally mastered a difficult reading passage, Jacob felt a joy he'd thought he'd never experience again. Emily, too, was changing under his guidance. She landed a promising position at a local non-profit, her natural administrative skills enhanced by Jacob's coaching. Watching her confidence grow, seeing her begin to rebuild her life, gave Jacob a sense of purpose he'd lost years ago. But with each success, each step forward, the questions about his past became harder to deflect. The turning point came during a celebration of Emily's new job. As they shared a modest cake in the shelter's common room, Michael asked innocently, "Will you stay with us now, Mr. Jacob, even when we get our own place?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Jacob looked at Emily, saw the same question in her eyes, and realized that his careful separation of past and present was becoming impossible to maintain. What none of them knew was that their growing connection had not gone unnoticed. In a high-rise office across town, Richard Sterling reviewed a report from his security team, his face darkening as he recognized the homeless man photographed with Emily's family. The wheels of fate had begun turning again, drawing Jacob back into the world he'd left behind, but this time with far more to lose than just his fortune. While we pause at this pivotal moment in Jacob's journey, I'd like to personally thank you for being here. Your support means everything to us, and by subscribing you'll be part of sharing these meaningful stories of redemption and hope with others who need to hear them. As Emily settled into her new job at Hope Community Foundation, Jacob's careful mentoring began to bear fruit. Her natural organizational skills, combined with his business insights, quickly made her an invaluable team member. The foundation's director, impressed by her abilities, began giving her increasingly responsible projects. What neither Emily nor Jacob knew was that the foundation received significant funding from Anderson Technologies' charitable arm, now controlled by Sterling. Trust grew between Emily and her colleagues, but so did her curiosity about Jacob's past. His intimate knowledge of corporate operations, his refined manner of speaking, and his strategic thinking seemed at odds with his homeless status. During their evening meetings, when he helped her analyze workplace challenges, his advice revealed a depth of business experience that went far beyond what he'd admitted. One particularly cold evening, while reviewing a foundation proposal, Emily noticed Jacob's reaction to a mention of Anderson Technologies. His hand trembled slightly, and for a brief moment his composed facade cracked. "You worked there, didn't you?" she asked gently. Jacob's silence spoke volumes. Before he could deflect, Michael burst in excitedly with his report card, momentarily saving Jacob from having to answer. The children's attachment to Jacob grew stronger each day. Michael began calling him Uncle Jake, while Sarah would save her drawings from school specifically to show him. Their progress in school improved dramatically under his tutoring, with Michael's math scores reaching the top of his class. The transformation in the children wasn't just academic, they carried themselves with new confidence, secure in the knowledge that they had a steady adult presence in their lives. During a parent-teacher conference, Emily's heart swelled with pride as Michael's teacher praised his improvement. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up," the teacher said. "It's rare to see such a positive change in a child who's experienced homelessness." Emily thought of Jacob, who had spent hours helping Michael understand fractions using real-world examples from his mysterious past. The shelter staff, initially wary of Jacob's influence, now sought his advice on helping other families. His approach, combining practical business skills with deep empathy, proved remarkably effective. Sister Margaret often found herself marveling at the contradiction: a homeless man teaching others how to rebuild their lives with the expertise of a seasoned executive. Their success story began attracting attention within the non-profit community. The foundation's newsletter featured Emily's family as an example of their program's effectiveness. The article included a photo of Emily and her children at a foundation event, with Jacob deliberately staying out of frame. But his influence was evident in every quote, every achievement mentioned. The growing visibility made Jacob increasingly uneasy. He began taking different routes to their meetings, avoiding main streets during busy hours. His street instincts, honed by years of survival, warned him that attention could be dangerous. Yet watching Emily and the children thrive made it impossible for him to step away. For the first time since his fall, he felt needed, valuable, purposeful. As Emily's position at the foundation became more secure, she began looking for permanent housing. Jacob helped her navigate rental applications, drawing on knowledge that seemed suspiciously detailed for someone who lived on the streets. When she found an affordable 2-bedroom apartment, his guidance through the lease negotiation process was invaluable. The prospect of Emily and the children moving into their own place stirred conflicting emotions in Jacob. He was proud of their progress, yet the thought of losing their daily interactions filled him with a profound sadness. The children had rekindled something he thought he'd lost forever, a sense of family, of belonging. Emily, noticing his melancholy, made it clear that having their own place didn't mean losing him. "You're part of our family now," she insisted. "That doesn't change with an address." But change was coming, whether they wanted it or not. The same day Emily signed her lease, a memo crossed Sterling's desk at Anderson Technologies. It detailed the foundation's recent successes, including a photo that caught his eye, a group shot where Jacob appeared in the background, almost hidden but unmistakable to someone who knew him. Sterling's reaction was immediate and calculated. Within hours, subtle inquiries began circulating about the foundation's new employee and her unusual homeless mentor. What no one yet realized was that Detective Sarah Thompson had also noticed the photo. After years of dead ends in her investigation of Anderson Technologies' corruption, she finally had a lead on the man whose case had never sat right with her. The threads of past and present were about to intertwine in ways that would test not just Jacob's newfound purpose, but the very foundations of the family he had helped build. As word of Emily's success spread through the non-profit community, subtle warning signs began to emerge. First came the seemingly innocent questions from foundation board members about her background and her relationship with Jacob. Then, routine paperwork for her position suddenly required additional scrutiny. The atmosphere at work shifted imperceptibly but unmistakably. Sterling's influence worked like a slow-acting poison. Anonymous concerns were raised about the foundation's liability in allowing a homeless man to interact with program recipients. Emily's supervisor, previously supportive, began suggesting she maintain more professional boundaries. The carefully crafted web of support Jacob had helped build started showing hairline cracks. One morning, Emily arrived at work to find her email access temporarily suspended due to a security review. When she questioned it, her supervisor mentioned vague concerns about her association with individuals of uncertain background. The message was clear: her connection to Jacob was becoming a liability. That evening, fighting tears, she shared the news with him in the park where they now held their meetings. "Maybe I should step back," Jacob suggested, his voice heavy with familiar resignation. But Emily's response was fierce no. "I won't let them do to us what they did to you at Anderson Technologies." The words hung in the air between them, her implicit acknowledgement of his past shocking them both. Before either could address it, Michael came running up, excited about his school science fair project, a moment of innocence interrupting the growing tension. The pressure escalated when Emily's apartment application was mysteriously flagged for additional verification. The property management company suddenly required extensive background checks not just on her, but on any regular visitors to the property. Jacob recognized Sterling's tactics, the same methodical dismantling of support systems he'd experienced during his own downfall. Sarah's asthma medication, previously covered by the foundation's employee health plan, became tangled in paperwork. The pharmacy reported insurance authorization delays, forcing Emily to pay out of pocket an expense she could barely afford. Each obstacle seemed designed to strain her resources and resolve, testing the limits of her loyalty to Jacob. The children began noticing the tension. Michael grew protective, standing guard during their park meetings, while Sarah's nightmares about living on the streets returned. Their school counselor reported concerns about their unusual home situation, triggering a visit from social services that left Emily shaken and angry. Community support, once strong, started wavering. Other parents at the children's school, who had welcomed Emily's family, now exchanged whispers at pickup time. The shelter staff, despite their respect for Jacob's work, began documenting his visits with uncomfortable thoroughness. Sister Margaret warned him gently about protecting the shelter's reputation. Anonymous letters arrived at the foundation office, hinting at past scandals and questioning Emily's judgment in her personal associations. Her colleagues, though outwardly friendly, grew cautious in their interactions. The isolation tactics were familiar to Jacob. He had watched his own support system crumble in similar ways years ago. Sterling's strategy became clearer when Emily received a career development opportunity, a promotion that would require her to relocate to another city. The offer was generous, the kind that would solve her financial struggles instantly. The implicit message was clear: choose between her family's security and her loyalty to Jacob. The situation reached a breaking point during Michael's school science fair. Jacob had helped him prepare an impressive project about urban environmental impact, a topic that inadvertently echoed his past work at Anderson Technologies. As they set up the display, Emily noticed men in suits photographing them from across the gymnasium. Later that evening, she received a call from her supervisor: "We need to discuss your continued employment with the foundation." Jacob, watching the familiar pattern unfold, faced an impossible choice. His presence was putting at risk everything Emily had worked to rebuild. Yet abandoning them felt like betraying not just this family, but his own redemption. As he walked the nighttime streets, wrestling with his decision, he was unaware that both Detective Thompson and Sterling's agents were monitoring his movements, each waiting for him to lead them to the truth they sought. What had started as a simple act of kindness had evolved into a complex web of loyalty, sacrifice, and impending confrontation. The question was no longer whether Jacob could protect Emily's family from his past, but whether exposing that past might be the only way to protect them. Emily found Jacob sitting alone in their usual park spot, his expression heavy with decision. The crisp autumn air carried the sound of children playing nearby, a painful reminder of what was at stake. "I have to leave," he said before she could speak. "You know they won't stop until I do." His voice carried the weight of someone who had lost everything once before and couldn't bear to watch it happen to someone else. Emily's response surprised them both with its intensity. "No," she stated firmly, sitting beside him. "That's exactly what they want: to isolate us, to make us feel powerless." Her years as an executive assistant had taught her to read between lines, to understand the power plays hidden behind corporate decisions. She pulled out a folder of documents. She'd been secretly gathering emails, meeting minutes, suspicious patterns in foundation decisions. Their conversation was interrupted by Michael's arrival from school, clutching his latest math test with pride. "Look, Uncle Jake, I got all the advanced problems right." The joy in his face made Jacob's planned departure feel impossible. Sarah followed closely behind, immediately climbing into his lap with the comfortable familiarity of family. The contrast between this moment of warmth and the cold calculations trying to destroy it strengthened their resolve. Detective Thompson watched this scene from her unmarked car, her perspective shifting. What had started as a routine investigation into corporate fraud was revealing itself as something more human, more complex. Her files on Sterling's activities had grown thick with evidence of systematic harassment and intimidation, but proving it would require Jacob's cooperation, something he'd been unwilling to give since his disappearance. That evening, as they gathered in Emily's small apartment for dinner, a ritual they'd established despite the growing pressure, Jacob shared more of his story. He told them about Anderson Technologies, about Sterling's betrayal, about the choice he'd made to protect his employees by taking the fall. Emily listened while preparing dinner, pieces of her own experiences at Carter Mills suddenly making sense. The children absorbed the story in their own ways. Michael, with his developing sense of justice, asked pointed questions about right and wrong. Sarah drew pictures of her family stick figures that included Jacob prominently. Their innocent responses to this complex situation gave Jacob a clarity he'd been missing. Running away wouldn't protect them, it would only teach them that injustice wins. Sister Margaret arrived unexpectedly, bringing news that would force their hand. The foundation board was meeting tomorrow to discuss Emily's position, and the outlook wasn't good. But she also brought hope evidence she'd been quietly collecting about similar patterns of intimidation at other organizations connected to Sterling. Sometimes, she said, looking meaningfully at Jacob, hiding from the truth hurts more people than fighting for it. Late into the night, after the children were asleep, Jacob, Emily, and Sister Margaret mapped out their options. Each choice carried risks. Fighting meant exposure, possible job loss, and uncertainty. Surrendering meant safety, but at the cost of their dignity and unity. The weight of the decision felt familiar to Jacob, reminiscent of that moment years ago when he'd chosen to take the fall rather than fight. Emily's small apartment became a war room of sorts. Their collective skills, Jacob's corporate knowledge, Emily's administrative expertise, Sister Margaret's community connections, combined to form the beginning of a strategy. They couldn't match Sterling's resources, but they had something he didn't expect: the truth and the determination to fight for it. As dawn approached, they reached a decision that would change everything. They would not only stand their ground but go on the offensive. Jacob would step out of the shadows, reclaim his identity, and fight not just for himself this time, but for every family Sterling had tried to break apart. Emily's documentation of the Foundation's suspicious activities would provide the first pieces of evidence. Looking at the sleeping children, Jacob felt a fierce protectiveness he hadn't experienced since losing his own family. This time would be different. This time he wasn't alone. This time running away would cost more than staying to fight. The struggle ahead would be difficult, but as he watched Emily methodically organizing their evidence, he realized they had already won something important: the courage to stand together against intimidation. Detective Thompson, monitoring the apartment from outside, noticed the lights still burning at dawn. She made a decision of her own, reaching for her phone to call her supervisor. It was time to move their investigation into the open. What she didn't know was that Sterling's surveillance team had come to a similar conclusion. The time for subtle pressure was ending. The next phase would require more direct action. Detective Sarah Thompson sat in her dimly lit office, walls covered with case files and connecting threads that all led back to Anderson Technologies. For 3 years, she had been quietly building a case against Sterling and Hayes, knowing something wasn't right about Jacob Anderson's sudden fall from grace. The photograph of him with Emily's family had finally given her the break she needed. Her investigation had uncovered a pattern far more extensive than initially suspected. Sterling and Hayes hadn't just orchestrated Jacob's downfall, they had systematically dismantled other ethical businesses through similar tactics. Each case followed the same template: find a vulnerability, exploit it through seemingly legitimate channels, and force decisions that benefited their hidden agenda. The evidence was mounting in neat, chronological stacks on her desk. Financial records showed suspicious patterns of contracts flowing through Hayes' office. Former employees of Anderson Technologies, now scattered across different companies, had started coming forward with stories that aligned too perfectly to be coincidental. But the key piece, Jacob's testimony, remained elusive. Sarah studied surveillance photos of Jacob with Emily's family, noting the careful way he carried himself, the protective stance toward the children, the flashes of his former self showing through his homeless disguise. Her own father had been a victim of corporate fraud, and she recognized the haunted look of someone carrying not just personal loss, but the weight of others' suffering. The breakthrough came unexpectedly through Sister Margaret. The nun had contacted the police tip line with documented incidents of harassment against families at her shelter who had connections to Anderson Technologies or its subsidiaries. Her meticulous records provided a pattern that matched Sarah's existing evidence perfectly. Working late into the night, Sarah connected new dots. The foundation where Emily worked wasn't just receiving funding from Anderson Technologies, it was being used as a monitoring system for potential threats to Sterling's operation. Every promotion offered to employees who asked too many questions led to effective exile in distant branches. The scope of Sterling and Hayes' corruption expanded with each new piece of evidence. They hadn't simply stolen a company, they had created an intricate system of corporate manipulation that affected hundreds of lives. Sarah's wall of evidence now included photos of other families like Emily's, all touched by the ripple effects of their schemes. One name kept appearing in the files: Martha Chen, the former Anderson Technologies accountant who had first noticed the discrepancies. Sarah tracked her down to a small accounting firm in Arizona, where she had fled after her resignation. In a lengthy phone interview, Martha revealed details about Sterling's early days at the company that filled crucial gaps in the timeline. The most disturbing discovery was how Sterling had manipulated the media coverage of Jacob's downfall. Sarah uncovered payments to key journalists, carefully crafted leaks of partial information, and a coordinated campaign to destroy Jacob's reputation. The same tactics were now being deployed against Emily, following an identical playbook. Sarah's team grew as evidence mounted. Junior detectives worked through stacks of financial records, its specialists tracked digital trails, and forensic accountants uncovered layers of hidden transactions. Each discovery reinforced her conviction that Jacob Anderson had been telling the truth all along. A crucial piece fell into place when she discovered Hayes' connection to the judge who had presided over Jacob's case. Regular payments, disguised as consulting fees, had flowed through a series of shell companies to the judge's family members. The corruption reached deeper into the legal system than anyone had suspected. As Sarah prepared to move her investigation into its active phase, she realized the timing was critical. Sterling's pressure on Emily's family was escalating, following the same pattern that had preceded Jacob's fall. This time, however, they would be ready. The question wasn't just about bringing down Sterling and Hayes anymore, it was about preventing history from repeating itself with new victims. What Sarah didn't know was that her investigation had not gone unnoticed. Sterling had informants throughout the police department, and reports of her progress were already reaching his desk. A separate file was being compiled on Detective Thompson herself, searching for vulnerabilities that could be exploited to stop her investigation before it went public. Family bonds strengthened in unexpected ways as pressure mounted around them. Emily and her children moved into a modest two-bedroom apartment, and despite his reluctance to accept help, Jacob found himself spending more time there than on the streets. The small living room became their sanctuary, filled with Michael's science projects and Sarah's artwork, each piece telling the story of their growing unity. During weekday evenings, the apartment buzzed with activity. Michael would spread his homework across the coffee table, Jacob patiently explaining complex math problems using real-world examples from his business days. Sarah, inspired by their new stability, filled sketchbooks with drawings of their family, always including Jacob with his distinctive beard and kind eyes. Emily watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and protective fear. Holidays, once a painful reminder of loss for both Jacob and Emily, transformed into celebrations of their unconventional family. For Thanksgiving, they hosted a small dinner that included Sister Margaret and some trusted friends from the shelter. Jacob, channeling skills from his corporate entertaining days, taught the children how to properly set a table and the importance of making guests feel welcome. Christmas brought its own miracles. The children insisted on making handmade gifts, spending weeks in secret preparation. Sarah crafted a colorful scrapbook of their family adventures. While Michael built a complex geometric sculpture he proudly explained represented Uncle Jake's help multiplying through our lives, Emily found herself crying when Jacob opened them, recognizing in his expression the same longing for family she'd carried since losing her parents. Their routines developed naturally. Sunday mornings became family breakfast time, with Jacob teaching the kids how to make his famous pancakes, a recipe he'd learned from his own father. These moments, filled with laughter and flour-dusted faces, helped heal old wounds for both adults. Emily discovered she could talk about her late father without pain, while Jacob shared carefully chosen stories about his own children. The children's school performances became family events, with Jacob sitting proudly beside Emily in the audience. Teachers noted the positive change in both children. Michael's confidence soared, while Sarah's anxiety decreased significantly. During parent-teacher conferences, Emily found herself automatically including Jacob in discussions about the children's progress. Even their struggles brought them closer. When Sarah had a severe asthma attack late one night, Jacob's calm presence helped everyone maintain composure. He remembered which medications went in which order, kept Michael occupied with logic puzzles to prevent panic, and supported Emily through her fear. That night, watching him doze in the hospital waiting room chair, Emily realized how completely he had become part of their family. Their bond grew strongest during quiet moments. Evening talks after the children were asleep, where Emily and Jacob shared their hopes and fears. Weekend afternoons in the park, teaching the kids games Jacob remembered from his own childhood. Small traditions emerged: Friday movie nights, Sunday evening planning sessions for the week ahead, celebrating even minor achievements with special desserts. The children's healing was perhaps the most visible sign of their family's strength. Michael's nightmares about homelessness faded, replaced by dreams of becoming an engineer like Uncle Jake used to be. Sarah's drawings evolved from dark, confused scribbles to bright family scenes, always featuring 4 people together. Their school counselor noted that both children showed remarkable resilience and emotional stability, despite their past trauma. As winter turned to spring, they began cautiously making future plans. Emily and Jacob discussed summer activities for the kids, debated educational options, and dreamed about possibilities they dared not voice fully. Their family unit, unconventional as it was, had become a source of strength none of them had expected to find. Yet beneath these moments of domestic peace, both adults carried a growing awareness of the threats surrounding them. They caught each other sharing worried glances when suspicious cars lingered too long outside, or when unexpected letters arrived from the Foundation. Their protective instincts, heightened by past experiences, made them increasingly careful about documenting their daily lives and movements. The children, intuitive as always, sensed the underlying tension. They became more vigilant about staying together in public, developed code words for dangerous situations, and watched their surroundings with growing awareness. Michael took his role as family protector seriously, while Sarah used her art to process her fears, filling private notebooks with drawings of the bad men she sometimes glimpsed watching their apartment. Despite these shadows, or perhaps because of them, their family bond grew stronger. Each threat reinforced their determination to protect what they'd built together. Emily and Jacob found themselves finishing each other's sentences, anticipating needs before they were voiced, moving in synchronized patterns of care and protection around the children. They were no longer just survivors helping each other. They had become a family forged in adversity, determined to stay together despite the growing storm around them. Sterling's relentless opposition intensified with calculated precision. The board meetings at Anderson Technologies grew more frequent, focusing on risk management and community engagement oversight. In his top-floor office, Sterling meticulously reviewed reports about Jacob's growing influence at the shelter and Emily's continued defiance of subtle pressures to distance herself from him. Surveillance teams maintained constant watch on Emily's apartment, documenting every visitor, every routine, every potential vulnerability. Sterling's network of informants expanded: the building's maintenance worker, a clerk at the children's school, even a volunteer at Sister Margaret's shelter. Each piece of information was carefully catalogued, building a comprehensive picture of their daily lives. Hayes, the corrupt official, grew increasingly nervous about the attention their actions were attracting. "We need to end this quickly," he insisted during a late-night meeting with Sterling. "Thompson's investigation is getting too close." Sterling's response was characteristically calm. "Pressure creates mistakes. We just need to apply it correctly." The campaign against Emily escalated systematically. Her work computer began experiencing technical issues that mysteriously erased her documentation of suspicious activities. Anonymous complaints about her professional conduct appeared in her personnel file. The Foundation's legal department initiated a review of all her past projects, citing procedural concerns. At the children's school, subtle forms of isolation took effect. Party invitations became scarce. Other parents, warned about potential issues with the family, kept their distance. Michael's science fair project, despite its excellence, received unexpectedly low marks. Sarah's art teacher expressed concerns about the dark themes in her recent drawings. Sterling's influence reached into every aspect of their lives. The apartment complex suddenly announced a rent increase. Citing market adjustments, Sarah's medical insurance faced new authorization requirements for her asthma medication. Even their regular grocery store mysteriously cancelled Emily's loyalty card, citing system updates. The pressure took its toll in small ways. Emily caught herself checking over her shoulder more frequently. Jacob began taking longer routes to avoid surveillance. The children developed their own warning systems, using coded words to alert each other about suspicious strangers. Their once peaceful home life gained an undercurrent of constant vigilance. Sterling's strategy meetings with his team revealed his thorough understanding of psychological warfare. "Target their sense of security," he instructed. "Make them question every relationship, every interaction." But his methods were deliberately designed to create isolation without leaving evidence of orchestration. The Foundation board, influenced by Sterling's subtle manipulations, began discussing the need for organizational restructuring. Emily's position was never directly threatened, but the implications were clear in every memo, every meeting, every casual conversation with management. Hayes utilized his government connections to add official pressure. Building inspectors appeared frequently at Emily's apartment complex. The children's school faced sudden audits of their special programs. Sister Margaret's shelter received unprecedented scrutiny of their operating procedures. Jacob watched these developments with growing recognition of Sterling's tactics. The pattern matched his own downfall: the gradual erosion of support, the creation of doubt, the systematic dismantling of resistance. But this time the stakes felt infinitely higher. It wasn't just his life being dismantled, but the safety and future of a family he had grown to love. Detective Thompson's investigation continued gathering evidence, but Sterling's influence slowed every process, buried every request in bureaucracy, challenged every warrant with legal technicalities. The corruption she uncovered reached deeper into the city's power structures than anyone had imagined. As pressure mounted, Jacob and Emily found their options narrowing. Each day brought new challenges: another denied request, another suspicious incident, another subtle threat. Sterling's strategy was working exactly as planned, isolating them, straining their resources, testing their resolve. Yet what Sterling hadn't counted on was the strength of the bonds he was trying to break. Each new pressure point reinforced their determination to protect what they had built. The family's unity, forged in shared adversity, proved more resilient than any corporate strategy could anticipate. The revelation that changed everything came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Emily was sorting through old files from her father's estate papers she'd never had the heart to examine fully after his death. From faded photographs and worn documents, she found a letter addressed to her, dated just before his suicide. The handwriting, shaky but determined, told a story that made her world shift on its axis. Her father, Thomas Carter, had been the head accountant at Anderson Technologies during Jacob's tenure. The letter detailed his discovery of Sterling's early corruption, the evidence he'd gathered, and his desperate attempts to alert Jacob to the impending betrayal. But Sterling had intercepted his warnings, using that information to accelerate his plans and systematically destroy both Jacob and Thomas. With trembling hands, Emily read about her father's final days. He had been gathering evidence, building a case against Sterling and Hayes, when the pressure became too intense. The letter contained access codes to a hidden email account, passwords to encrypted files, and locations of stored documents, a dead man's insurance policy that had waited years to be discovered. She found Jacob at their usual meeting spot in the park, despite the rain, his face already weathered by years on the street, aged further as she shared her discovery. Thomas, he whispered, the name heavy with recognition. He tried to warn me. I should have seen it, the weight of their connected past pressed down on both of them, years of unspoken guilt and loss finally finding voice. The children, sensing the gravity of the moment, sat unusually quiet as Emily and Jacob pieced together the full story in her small apartment. Michael, with his sharp mind for details, asked questions that helped connect crucial dots. Sarah, clutching her ever-present sketchbook, drew pictures of the story as it unfolded, her innocent illustrations capturing the complex web of betrayal and redemption. Detective Thompson arrived unannounced later that evening, drawn by her own investigation's findings. In her hands were files that corroborated Thomas Carter's letter, financial records, email trails, and surveillance reports that painted a damning picture of Sterling and Hayes' conspiracy. The pieces were finally falling into place, revealing a pattern of corruption that stretched back years before Jacob's fall. The apartment became a war room as they spread out their combined evidence. Emily's inherited documents, Jacob's memories, and Thompson's investigation files created a comprehensive timeline of Sterling's systematic destruction of lives and livelihoods. Sister Margaret joined them, bringing her own records of families affected by Sterling's schemes over the years. Jacob stood at the window, watching the rain while the others worked. The weight of Thomas Carter's sacrifice pressed heavily on him, another good man destroyed by the same corruption that had taken everything from him. But now, looking at Emily and her children, he realized that perhaps Thomas's final act had created an unexpected path to justice. Emily found herself torn between grief for her father and anger at the years of deception. Her childhood memories of his final months took on new meaning: his distraction, his late nights at work, his desperate attempts to protect her from what he knew was coming. The truth of his death transformed him from a victim of depression to a casualty of corporate warfare. Sarah, with a child's intuitive understanding, brought them back to the present moment. She presented Jacob with a drawing, a family portrait that included both him and a smiling figure she labeled Grandpa in Heaven. The simple gesture broke the tension, reminding them all that redemption sometimes comes through unexpected channels. Detective Thompson watched this family moment with professional interest but growing personal investment. The human cost of corporate corruption lay bare before her, not just in files and evidence, but in the lives of these people who had found each other through their shared wounds. The rain continued outside as they formulated their plan. They had evidence, they had witnesses, and most importantly, they had the truth that Thomas Carter had died protecting. The question was no longer whether to fight back, but how to ensure that this time justice would prevail where it had failed before. Sterling's surveillance team, watching the apartment from across the street, noted the unusual gathering but couldn't hear the conversations that would soon threaten their entire operation. Inside, a family forged by loss and strengthened by love prepared for a battle that would finally bring the truth to light. The confrontation erupted at the Foundation's annual gala, where Sterling had orchestrated what he thought would be Emily's final humiliation. The elegant ballroom of the Grand Hotel buzzed with Detroit's elite, unaware they were about to witness the unraveling of one of the city's most powerful men. Emily, elegant in a borrowed dress, stood near the podium where Sterling would soon speak, her father's evidence secure in her clutch. Jacob, cleaned up and wearing a donated suit, positioned himself near the service entrance. For the first time in years, he carried himself with his old authority, the homeless man's protective slouch replaced by a CEO's posture. Detective Thompson and her team blended with the crowd, their presence unknown to Sterling's security detail. Sterling's speech began predictably, touting the Foundation's achievements and corporate responsibility. His practiced charm worked the room until Emily, following their carefully planned strategy, asked a simple question about Thomas Carter's accounting reports. The slight falter in Sterling's smooth delivery was all they needed. What followed was a masterclass in corporate confrontation. Jacob emerged from the shadows, his voice carrying the weight of years of injustice as he laid out the evidence of Sterling's corruption. The room fell silent as he described the systematic destruction of lives, families, and ethical businesses, all sacrificed to Sterling's greed. Emily's presentation of her father's documents, projected on the gala's massive screens, left no room for denial. Emails, financial records, and surveillance reports revealed the elaborate conspiracy that had destroyed both Jacob and Thomas. Sterling's attempts to dismiss the accusations died as Detective Thompson stepped forward, badge displayed with federal agents moving to secure the exits. Hayes, attending as a distinguished guest, tried to slip away but found his path blocked by Sister Margaret and a group of former Anderson Technologies employees, all victims of his corrupt dealings. The sight of the nun calmly blocking his escape would later become a symbol of the evening in media coverage. The children, watching from a safe distance with trusted friends, saw their Uncle Jake transform from a homeless mentor into a commanding presence that held the attention of hundreds. Michael's eyes shone with pride, while Sarah sketched the scene furiously, capturing the moment of justice her grandfather had died trying to achieve. Sterling's composure cracked as more evidence emerged. Former employees stepped forward with their stories, each account adding to the picture of systematic corruption. His desperate attempt to turn the narrative against Jacob backfired as Detective Thompson revealed the extent of her investigation, including proof of Sterling's recent harassment campaign against Emily's family. The Foundation board members, many of whom had supported Sterling for years, watched in shock as their carefully maintained illusions of corporate philanthropy crumbled. Jacob's reputation for ethical business practices stood in stark contrast to the corruption being exposed before them. Securities and Exchange Commission representatives, coordinating with Detective Thompson, moved through the crowd collecting additional evidence and testimony. Sterling's empire began crumbling in real time as news of the raid spread through financial networks, causing immediate market reactions. Emily's voice, strong with emotion, delivered the final blow as she read from her father's last letter. The words echoed through the ballroom, telling the story of a man who chose truth over survival, who died trying to protect others from the corruption he'd uncovered. Sterling's face showed real fear for the first time as he realized the completeness of his defeat. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. As federal agents led Sterling and Hayes away, Jacob found himself surrounded by former colleagues, employees, and board members, many offering apologies and support that came years too late. But his attention remained focused on Emily and the children, his true priority in this long-awaited moment of justice. For Sarah and Michael, watching from their vantage point, it was like seeing a story of knights and dragons play out in real life. Their Uncle Jake had emerged from his exile to confront the forces that had hurt so many. Their mother had stood strong against power and corruption, and good had triumphed over evil in a way that would shape their understanding of justice forever. The legal battle unfolded across months of intense court proceedings, capturing national attention as a symbol of corporate accountability. The federal courthouse became a daily battleground where decades of corruption were methodically exposed. Jacob, no longer hiding in shadows, testified for weeks, his dignified presence and clear testimony captivating jury and media alike. Emily's presentation of her father's evidence proved devastating to the defense. Thomas Carter's meticulous documentation, combined with Detective Thompson's investigation, created an airtight case against Sterling and Hayes. Each day revealed new layers of corruption, reaching into government offices, judges' chambers, and corporate boardrooms across the city. Sterling's defense team, among the most expensive in the country, tried every tactic to discredit the evidence. They painted Jacob as a bitter ex-CEO seeking revenge, questioned Emily's mental state following her father's suicide, and attempted to dismiss Thomas Carter's documents as the paranoid ramblings of a troubled man. Each attack strengthened the public's support for the victims. The children's presence in the courtroom gallery during key testimonies added a powerful human element to the proceedings. Michael's serious face and Sarah's continuous sketching of the events became symbolic images in media coverage. Their unwavering support of Jacob, despite defense attempts to paint him as a dangerous influence, touched even the most cynical observers. Sister Margaret's testimony about the pattern of families destroyed by Sterling's schemes brought many in the courtroom to tears. She presented years of careful documentation showing how Sterling's corruption had rippled through the community, affecting countless lives. Her quiet dignity and precise recall made her an unimpeachable witness. Former Anderson Technologies employees came forward in waves, each adding pieces to the puzzle. Martha Chen's testimony about the early warning signs she'd noticed carried particular weight, validated by years of subsequent evidence. The pattern of intimidation and destruction became impossible to ignore. Hayes cracked under cross-examination, attempting to save himself by revealing even more extensive corruption. His detailed account of how they had manipulated the legal system, including the bribing of judges and intimidation of witnesses, led to a wave of additional investigations and arrests. The turning point came when Sterling himself took the stand. His carefully constructed facade crumbled under relentless questioning. Emily watched, holding her children's hands, as the man responsible for her father's death finally revealed his true nature to the world. His arrogant attempts to justify his actions only strengthened the prosecution's case. Detective Thompson's methodical presentation of evidence left no room for reasonable doubt. Financial records, surveillance footage, email trails, and witness testimonies created a comprehensive picture of corruption that spanned more than a decade. The jury's deliberations were remarkably brief. The verdict, when it came, was unanimous on all counts. Sterling and Hayes were found guilty of multiple charges including fraud, corruption, and conspiracy. The judge's sentencing statement specifically referenced Thomas Carter's sacrifice and Jacob's years of unjust exile. Additional indictments were already being prepared for dozens of co-conspirators. Media coverage of the verdict focused on the human story: the homeless former CEO who had found redemption helping others, the daughter who uncovered her father's last battle, the children who had drawn strength from their unconventional family. Pictures of Jacob hugging Emily and the kids outside the courthouse became powerful symbols of justice and healing. The impact rippled through corporate America. New legislation was proposed to strengthen whistleblower protections and corporate accountability. Anderson Technologies Board, completely restructured, initiated a comprehensive review of all operations and policies. The foundation underwent similar transformations, with Emily playing a key role in its reformation. Yet amid the public victory, private battles remained. Jacob faced the challenge of reclaiming his identity after years of anonymity. Emily struggled with renewed grief over her father's death, even as she celebrated the justice he had helped achieve. The children, while proud of their family's role in exposing corruption, worried about maintaining the close bonds they'd formed during harder times. The aftermath of the trial brought unexpected challenges that tested their newfound stability. Despite Sterling's conviction, his network of influence remained active, working subtly to undermine the family's recovery. The shelter where Jacob had helped so many families suddenly faced mysterious building code violations, forcing temporary closures and displacing vulnerable residents. Emily's position at the foundation, though seemingly secure after the verdict, became increasingly isolated. Longtime colleagues, fearful of association with such a high-profile case, maintained professional distance. Board members, while publicly supportive, delayed approvals for her initiatives. The subtle resistance created an atmosphere of constant tension. The children began showing signs of stress from the prolonged public attention. Michael's grades slipped as classmates pestered him with questions about the trial. Sarah's previously bright artwork turned darker, filled with courtroom scenes and shadowy figures. Their school counselor reported increased anxiety in both children, particularly around unfamiliar adults. Jacob struggled with his abrupt return to visibility. Years of street survival had ingrained habits that clashed with his renewed public role. He found himself automatically scanning for exits in board meetings, flinching at camera flashes, retreating into silence when crowds pressed too close. The trauma of his homeless years emerged in unexpected ways. The media's constant presence became a source of daily strain. Reporters camped outside their apartment, following the children to school, turning every family outing into a potential news story. Privacy, already precious during their months of hiding, now seemed impossible to maintain. Detective Thompson warned them about continuing investigations into Sterling's remaining allies. Each new revelation brought fresh waves of public attention and potential threats. Security measures became a constant consideration, restricting the family's movements and interactions. The financial impact hit hard despite the legal victory. Legal fees had drained Emily's savings, and the Foundation's subtle retaliation affected her job security. But Jacob's potential compensation from Anderson Technologies remained tied up in appeals, leaving them financially vulnerable just when stability seemed within reach. Sister Margaret reported increasing pressure on the shelter's funding sources. Organizations that had previously supported their work withdrew, citing budget constraints, but clearly responding to unseen influence. The community support system they'd helped build began showing dangerous cracks. Most painfully, the stress began affecting their family dynamics. Emily found herself snapping at the children over small issues, then drowning in guilt. Jacob withdrew into himself, spending long hours walking the city as he had during his homeless years. The easy warmth of their earlier relationships struggled under the weight of public scrutiny and constant pressure. The children responded to the tension in their own ways. Michael became fiercely protective, challenging anyone who approached his family with suspicious intensity. Sarah stopped drawing altogether, her artistic expression silenced by anxiety. Their hard-won sense of security began to feel like another thing Sterling had managed to steal from them. Each small victory in court seemed to bring new challenges at home. The conviction of another corrupt official would coincide with an anonymous complaint about Emily's work performance. Positive media coverage would be followed by mysterious problems with their apartment's utilities. The pattern of retaliation became exhaustingly predictable. As autumn turned to winter, they found themselves fighting not just external pressures but their own fears and doubts. The question hung unspoken between them: had their pursuit of justice cost them the very peace and stability they'd fought to achieve? The weight of this uncertainty pressed heavily on their once confident unity, threatening to unravel the bonds they'd formed in darker times. Their story, celebrated in the media as a triumph of justice, felt increasingly like a Pyrrhic victory. The personal cost of their courage revealed itself in quiet moments, in Michael's nightmares, in Sarah's silence, in Emily's sleepless nights, in Jacob's renewed instinct to disappear. They had won the battle, but found themselves wondering if they were losing the more important war, the fight to preserve their family's hard-won happiness. The true cost of their fight for justice revealed itself in a series of crushing sacrifices. The Foundation's board, despite public support for Emily, began implementing restructuring that systematically dismantled her programs. Her initiatives for homeless families were quietly defunded, while her role was gradually stripped of meaningful responsibility. The message was clear: her victory had come at a professional price. Jacob faced his own battles as Anderson Technologies shareholders demanded his testimony in endless civil suits. Each court appearance forced him to relive his downfall, picking apart decisions made years ago while defending his original ethical stance. The psychological toll of repeatedly confronting his past began to show in renewed insomnia and anxiety attacks. But the children bore silent witness to their guardian's struggles. Michael's protective instincts transformed into angry outbursts at school, while Sarah retreated further into herself, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Their hard-won sense of family stability began to crack under the pressure of constant scrutiny and unending legal battles. Sister Margaret brought devastating news one rainy evening: the shelter would be forced to close due to suddenly withdrawn funding. The same pattern of systematic dismantling that had destroyed Jacob's company was now targeting the support systems they'd built for other vulnerable families. The weight of responsibility for those affected added to their growing burden. Emily's health began to suffer under the constant strain. Stress-induced migraines kept her from work, while anxiety about the children's well-being led to sleepless nights. The strong, defiant woman who had stood up to Sterling in court found herself struggling to maintain composure during routine parent-teacher conferences. The media's attention, initially supportive, took a darker turn as Sterling's allies pushed alternative narratives. Stories appeared questioning Jacob's relationship with the family, suggesting inappropriate motivations behind his mentorship of the children. Each new headline felt like a personal attack, forcing them to defend not just their legal victory but their very right to be a family. Financial pressures mounted as legal fees drained their resources. Emily's reduced role at the foundation meant a significant pay cut, while Jacob's potential compensation remained tied up in appeals. They found themselves facing the same economic insecurity that had initially brought them together, but now with the added weight of public scrutiny. The children's school life became increasingly difficult. Other parents, influenced by negative press coverage, discouraged their children from associating with Michael and Sarah. Invitations to birthday parties stopped coming. Playground interactions became strained. The social isolation began to mirror what Jacob had experienced during his years on the streets. Detective Thompson warned them about continuing threats, necessitating increased security measures that further disrupted their daily lives. Simple activities like grocery shopping or visiting the park became complex operations requiring constant vigilance. But their home, once a sanctuary, felt more like a fortress. Jacob struggled with guilt over the impact his presence had on the family. He caught himself planning escape routes, considering whether his absence might allow Emily and the children to reclaim some normalcy. The street survival instincts that had kept him alive for years whispered that running might be the kindest choice. Sarah's asthma worsened under the stress, leading to frequent hospital visits that strained both finances and emotions. During one particularly bad attack, Emily broke down in the emergency room, the weight of everything finally overwhelming her carefully maintained composure. Jacob held her as she sobbed, both of them knowing their challenges were far from over. The final blow came when Emily's apartment building was sold to a developer with connections to Sterling's former associates. Despite their lease, renovation plans were announced that would effectively force them out. The timing and circumstances left no doubt that it was another calculated move to destabilize their lives. As winter deepened, they found themselves facing impossible choices. Each small victory in their fight for justice seemed to demand greater sacrifices from the family they were trying to protect. The question hung unspoken between them: how much more could they lose in their pursuit of what was right? The darkest moment came on a bitter December evening when all their struggles seemed to converge. Emily arrived home to find an eviction notice, despite their perfect payment record. Hours later, she received an email announcing her temporary reassignment to a foundation office 3 states away. The systematic dismantling of their lives had reached its crescendo. Jacob found Michael in tears behind the school, having fought with classmates who'd repeated media slurs about their family. Sarah's teacher called about her complete withdrawal in class, expressing concerns about trauma. The children they'd worked so hard to protect were bearing the heaviest burden of their fight for justice. Sister Margaret brought news that compounded their despair: the shelter would close within weeks. The new owners, a development company with ties to Sterling's network, had plans for luxury condominiums. Dozens of families they'd helped would soon face the same homelessness they'd fought to escape. The pressure began fracturing their unity. Emily and Jacob's late-night discussions turned into tense arguments about next steps. She couldn't abandon her work with vulnerable families. He couldn't bear watching the children suffer for their principles. The specter of separation loomed over their once unshakable bond. Sarah's health deteriorated rapidly under the stress. Her asthma attacks increased, requiring multiple emergency room visits. During one particularly frightening episode, Jacob found himself holding her hand in the hospital, promising everything would be okay, while knowing he might have to leave to protect them all. Michael's protective instincts turned to anger. His grades plummeted as he spent more time defending his family than studying. The bright, curious boy who'd loved mathematics became withdrawn and defensive, his potential dimming under the weight of their circumstances. The media circus intensified as Sterling's appeals process began. New allegations emerged daily, each more outrageous than the last. Photos of their family were splashed across newspapers with inflammatory headlines questioning their motives and relationships. Their private pain became public entertainment. Financial reality hit hard as Emily's reduced salary barely covered essentials. Jacob's presence, while emotionally crucial, added strain to their limited resources. The dreams they'd begun to build of stability, education, a real home seemed to crumble around them. Detective Thompson arrived one evening with disturbing news evidence suggested a coordinated effort to separate their family. Child services had received anonymous complaints, job offers were being sabotaged, and surveillance had increased. Their opponents were playing a long game of attrition. The apartment, once their sanctuary, felt increasingly unsafe. Strange cars lingered outside, mail went missing, and unexplained maintenance issues plagued their daily lives. The security measures necessary for protection transformed their home into something resembling a prison. Emily found herself facing an impossible choice when her supervisor presented an ultimatum: accept the transfer or face termination. The decision would either separate their family or plunge them into financial crisis. The weight of responsibility for her children's future pressed against her loyalty to Jacob and their shared principles. The children sensed the impending fracture. Sarah's artwork, when she drew it all, depicted their family being pulled apart by dark forces. Michael began sleeping in the living room, as if his presence could prevent their unit from dissolving. Their fear of abandonment manifested in heart-wrenching ways. Jacob spent sleepless nights wrestling with his role in their suffering. His street instincts screamed for him to run, to remove himself from the equation and give them a chance at normalcy. Yet the thought of leaving them felt like surrendering to the very forces they'd fought against. Time seemed to be running out as deadlines loomed: the eviction notice, Emily's transfer, the shelter's closure. Each tick of the clock brought them closer to decisions that would irrevocably change their lives. The victory they'd achieved in court felt hollow against the personal cost they continued to pay. In their darkest hour, huddled together in their increasingly bare apartment, they faced the possibility that fighting for justice might cost them everything they held dear. The question wasn't just whether they could survive these challenges, but whether the price of their principles had become too high for their family to bear. Detective Thompson's decisive move came without warning. On a snowy morning, her team simultaneously raided multiple locations across the city, seizing documents and digital records that revealed the full scope of Sterling's continuing influence. The evidence painted a devastating picture of corruption that extended far beyond their original case. From her years of investigation, Thompson had assembled a complex web of connections linking Sterling's allies to dozens of seemingly unrelated events: the shelter's closure threats, Emily's workplace pressures, the children's school issues, and the apartment eviction. Each act of retaliation had been carefully orchestrated through a network of shell companies and paid intermediaries. The raid uncovered encrypted communications between Sterling and his associates, detailing their systematic campaign to destroy Jacob and Emily's family. The messages revealed a chilling level of surveillance and coordination, with Sterling continuing to direct operations from his prison cell through a sophisticated network of corrupt lawyers and business associates. Email trails exposed how Sterling had manipulated the Foundation's board through financial pressure and blackmail. Board members' sudden resistance to Emily's programs was traced directly to threats against their own interests. The pattern of corporate manipulation that had destroyed Jacob's company was still actively destroying lives. The most damning were the documents linking high-ranking city officials to the campaign against the shelter. Thompson's team discovered that the building code violations, funding cuts, and development plans were part of a larger scheme to eliminate support systems for witnesses and victims of corporate fraud. But the investigation revealed a sophisticated disinformation campaign behind the negative media coverage. Sterling's network had planted stories, manipulated sources, and pressured journalists to undermine public support for Jacob and Emily's family. The truth behind the headlines exposed the depth of corporate influence over public narrative. Bank records showed an intricate money laundering operation funding these activities. Thompson's forensic accountants traced millions flowing through offshore accounts, all dedicated to maintaining Sterling's power even after his conviction. The financial web extended into legitimate businesses, charities, and government offices. But perhaps most shocking was evidence that Sterling's allies had infiltrated child protective services, attempting to manufacture grounds for separating the children from both Emily and Jacob. Thompson's discovery of these plans came just days before they were set to be executed, preventing what could have been a devastating blow to the family. The investigation uncovered recordings of Sterling's prison conversations, revealing his obsession with destroying not just Jacob's reputation but any possibility of redemption or happiness. His hatred had evolved into a methodical determination to eliminate anyone who threatened his legacy of corruption. As Thompson's team processed the evidence, patterns emerged showing how Sterling's influence had shaped city policy for decades. The corruption wasn't limited to corporate fraud, it had systematically undermined social services, housing access, and economic opportunity for vulnerable populations. Files recovered from encrypted servers detailed surveillance operations against multiple families connected to the original Anderson Technologies case. Sterling's network had created a sophisticated system for identifying and neutralizing potential threats to their operations, treating human lives as mere obstacles to be removed. The scope of the conspiracy proved far larger than anyone had imagined. Thompson's investigation revealed connections to similar operations in other cities, suggesting a national network of corporate corruption designed to protect wealthy criminals while punishing those who dared to expose them. What Sterling hadn't counted on was Thompson's methodical approach to building a case. Over years of investigation, she had created a parallel network of witnesses, whistleblowers, and evidence, waiting for the right moment to expose the entire operation. The morning raids were the culmination of careful planning and timing. For Jacob and Emily, watching the news unfold from their apartment, each revelation brought a mix of vindication and horror. The proof of what they'd been fighting against finally existed in undeniable form, but the scale of corruption they'd challenged was staggering. Their personal struggle had been part of a much larger battle for justice. Media vindication came in waves as Detective Thompson's evidence became public. Major news networks led with dramatic exposes detailing Sterling's ongoing criminal enterprise. Headlines that had once questioned Jacob and Emily's credibility now praised their courage in standing against systemic corruption. The public narrative shifted dramatically as the truth emerged. The New York Times published a comprehensive investigation titled The Shadow Empire, chronicling how Sterling had maintained control even from prison. Their reporting included heartbreaking interviews with families who had faced similar retaliation, creating a powerful picture of corporate vindictiveness that had destroyed countless lives. Emily's father, Thomas Carter, emerged as a heroic figure in the coverage. His meticulous documentation, preserved through years of uncertainty, provided the foundation for exposing Sterling's methods. Financial journals analyzed his original findings, confirming that he had identified the corruption patterns that would eventually destroy both his and Jacob's lives. Television specials featured emotional interviews with Sister Margaret and shelter residents, revealing how Sterling's network had systematically attacked support systems for vulnerable populations. Security footage showing surveillance teams monitoring the shelter and Emily's apartment outraged viewers who had previously dismissed their fears as paranoia. The children's story particularly resonated with the public. Images of Sarah's drawings chronicling their family's struggles appeared in major magazines. Michael's confrontations with bullies were reframed as a child's brave defense of truth against powerful interests. Their resilience became a symbol of hope against corporate intimidation. Former Anderson Technologies employees came forward in droves, sharing their own stories of witnessing the company's transformation under Sterling. Their accounts corroborated Jacob's original concerns and demonstrated how ethical business practices had been systematically dismantled for profit. Investigative reporters uncovered the full extent of Sterling's media manipulation. Journalists who had written critical stories about Jacob's family admitted to receiving pressure and incentives from Sterling's network. The exposure forced several prominent news organizations to issue retractions and apologies. Professional journals in business and law analyzed Thompson's evidence, highlighting how Sterling's operations had created a blueprint for corporate retaliation against whistleblowers. Academic studies began examining the long-term social impact of systematic corporate corruption on community institutions. Emily's position at the foundation was completely recontextualized. Board members, their own manipulation by Sterling now exposed, publicly acknowledged the pressure they'd faced to undermine her work. Her programs for homeless families were reinstated with expanded funding and support. Digital media played a crucial role in spreading the truth. Social networks filled with shared stories from people who had encountered Sterling's influence in various ways. The hashtag #JusticeForJacob trended nationally as public support swelled for their family's struggle. The revelation of Sterling's continued criminal activities from prison led to new legal proceedings. Coverage of these hearings highlighted the sophistication of his network and the extent of his influence over supposedly legitimate institutions. Each new disclosure reinforced the validity of Jacob and Emily's original claims. Local news focused on the community impact, particularly the threatened shelter closure. When evidence emerged linking the development company to Sterling's network, public pressure forced them to withdraw their plans. The shelter not only remained open but received an outpouring of support and donations. Perhaps most significantly, the media began examining their own role in perpetuating corporate power structures. Editorial boards acknowledged how financial pressures and advertising relationships had influenced coverage of corporate misconduct. The story became a catalyst for discussions about journalistic integrity and accountability. But as winter turned to spring, the narrative had completely transformed. The family once portrayed as suspicious was now celebrated for their resilience and courage. Their story became a powerful reminder of the importance of standing firm against corruption, no matter the personal cost. The community response was both immediate and overwhelming. Within days of Thompson's revelations, a grassroots movement emerged to support families affected by Sterling's retaliation. Local businesses, previously hesitant to associate with Jacob's cause, now openly offered assistance. The neighborhood coffee shop where Emily often worked became a hub for organizing support efforts. Religious leaders from various faiths united behind Sister Margaret, transforming her shelter into a symbol of resistance against corporate intimidation. Congregations organized fundraisers and volunteer drives, ensuring the facility would not only remain open but expand its services. The threat of closure transformed into an opportunity for community renewal. At the children's school, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Teachers who had been cautious about showing support now incorporated lessons about corporate responsibility and civic courage into their curriculum. Michael's classmates, understanding the truth behind his family's struggles, became fierce allies. The bullying that had plagued him transformed into admiration. Sarah's artwork, once confined to private sketchbooks, was featured in a community gallery exhibition titled Through a Child's Eyes: Corporate Corruption and Family Resilience. Her powerful images of their family's journey drew hundreds of visitors and sparked important conversations about the human cost of corporate misconduct. Local lawyers formed a coalition offering pro bono services to families impacted by Sterling's network. They established a legal clinic at Sister Margaret's shelter, helping residents navigate the complexities of corporate retaliation. Emily's workplace challenges became a case study in whistleblower protection reform. The apartment complex's new management, embarrassed by their role in Sterling's schemes, offered Emily a long-term lease at reduced rent. Neighbors who had kept their distance now organized building-wide support initiatives, creating a safety network that allowed the children to play freely again. Technology companies developed apps and platforms to help identify patterns of corporate retaliation, inspired by Jacob and Emily's experience. These tools, made freely available to non-profits and advocacy groups, helped other victims recognize and document systematic harassment. Universities invited Jacob to speak about business ethics and corporate responsibility. His journey from CEO to homeless advocate to justice crusader resonated deeply with students and faculty alike. Academic institutions began incorporating his story into their business ethics curricula. Emily's foundation colleagues, freed from Sterling's influence, rallied around her programs. New initiatives for corporate accountability and social responsibility emerged, with Emily leading efforts to protect vulnerable families from systematic discrimination. Her father's legacy inspired a scholarship program for children affected by corporate fraud. The shelter became a model for community resilience. Corporate volunteers, many from Anderson Technologies' rank and file, offered job training and mentorship programs. Sister Margaret's approach to combining social services with advocacy for corporate accountability attracted national attention. Local government officials, their ties to Sterling's network exposed, faced intense public pressure for reform. Town halls and community meetings focused on strengthening oversight of corporate influence in public services. The City Council passed new regulations protecting social service organizations from retaliatory development practices. Mental health professionals organized support groups for families dealing with corporate retaliation, using Jacob and Emily's experience to help others recognize and resist systematic intimidation. Their story provided a framework for understanding the psychological impact of corporate harassment. The children's recovery became a community priority. Teachers, counselors, and fellow parents worked together to create a supportive environment for their healing. Michael's interest in mathematics was nurtured through special mentoring programs, while Sarah's artistic talents received encouragement from local artists. As spring approached, the community's response had transformed their struggle from a private battle into a movement for corporate accountability and social justice. Their family's resilience had inspired a broader awakening to the importance of standing together against systematic corruption. The federal courtroom fell silent as Sterling and his associates faced sentencing for their continued criminal enterprise. The judge's voice carried historic weight as she delivered an unprecedented 40-year sentence, citing the extraordinary malice and systematic destruction of lives revealed in Thompson's investigation. Hayes, facing his own reckoning, received 25 years for his role in the ongoing corruption. Evidence from Thompson's raid led to the indictment of 37 additional conspirators, including corporate executives, government officials, and legal professionals who had facilitated Sterling's operations from prison. Each arrest unveiled new layers of corruption, leading to reform initiatives in multiple cities. The corporate landscape underwent seismic shifts as the full scope of Sterling's influence emerged. Anderson Technologies, under new leadership, instituted sweeping reforms in corporate governance. Other companies, fearing similar exposure, rushed to establish genuine ethical oversight and whistleblower protection programs. Civil settlements brought significant compensation to families harmed by Sterling's retaliation. The federal judge ordered the creation of a victims' fund worth hundreds of millions, ensuring that those who had lost homes, jobs, and opportunities would receive meaningful restitution. Emily's father's estate was posthumously awarded substantial damages. Class action lawsuits against Sterling's network of shell companies revealed systematic patterns of harassment and intimidation. The resulting settlements established new precedents for corporate accountability, making it financially ruinous for companies to engage in retaliatory practices against whistleblowers and their families. Legislative reform followed as congressional hearings highlighted the need for stronger protections against corporate retaliation. New laws, some informally called the Anderson Acts, created robust safeguards for whistleblowers and their families. Corporate immunity provisions were significantly curtailed. The judicial system underwent its own reckoning as investigations revealed the extent of Sterling's influence over legal proceedings. Several judges faced disbarment, while new guidelines were established to prevent corporate interests from manipulating court outcomes. Jacob's original conviction was formally vacated. Media organizations, exposed for their role in Sterling's disinformation campaigns, adopted stricter standards for corporate coverage. Industry-wide reforms included new protocols for investigating corporate misconduct and protecting sources who expose wrongdoing. The press became an ally in corporate accountability. All financial institutions that had facilitated Sterling's operations faced severe penalties and regulatory oversight. The banking system's role in enabling corporate retaliation led to new compliance requirements and monitoring systems. The economic infrastructure that had supported systematic harassment was dismantled. Professional associations began revoking credentials from individuals implicated in Sterling schemes. Law firms, accounting practices, and consulting agencies that had enabled corporate retaliation faced industry sanctions. The professional cost of enabling corporate misconduct became prohibitively high. Thompson's investigative methods became a model for corporate crime units nationwide. Her approach to documenting patterns of retaliation and building networks of witnesses transformed how law enforcement addressed systematic corporate abuse. Training programs incorporated lessons from her investigation. The shelter system received substantial support through settlement funds, enabling expansion of services and creation of new facilities. Sister Margaret's approach to combining social services with advocacy became a blueprint for similar programs nationwide. The infrastructure of support for vulnerable families grew stronger. As the legal proceedings concluded, each guilty verdict and settlement announcement felt like another brick being removed from the wall of corporate impunity that Sterling had built. The system that had protected powerful interests at the expense of ordinary people was being dismantled, piece by piece. The final hearing ended with Sterling's complete financial disgrace, his empire of shell companies and hidden assets stripped away. The man who had once wielded enormous power through fear and corruption would spend the remainder of his life imprisoned, his legacy one of cautionary justice rather than corporate success. The process of healing began quietly, in small moments shared between family members who had weathered an impossible storm together. Emily's promotion to Executive Director of Community Programs at the Foundation came with the freedom to implement her vision for supporting vulnerable families. Her father's principles of ethical business practices became the cornerstone of her leadership. Jacob's formal adoption of the children proceeded without opposition, the courts recognizing the deep bonds forged through their shared struggles. The day they legally became a family, Michael proudly announced his intention to study corporate law to protect people like us, while Sarah presented a drawing of their family titled "Finally Forever." Their new home, purchased with settlement funds, became a haven for healing. Each room reflected their journey: Michael's study space filled with mathematics and law books, Sarah's art studio brightened by windows, Emily's home office decorated with advocacy awards, and Jacob's library stocked with books on ethical business practices and social justice. The children's recovery manifested in touching ways. Michael's nightmares about homelessness transformed into dreams of becoming a defender of justice. Sarah's artwork evolved from dark scenes of persecution to vibrant celebrations of family and community. Their academic performance soared as security and stability returned to their lives. Emily and Jacob's relationship deepened through their shared commitment to helping others. They established the Thomas Carter Foundation for Corporate Ethics, providing support for whistleblowers and their families. Their partnership, tested by extraordinary circumstances, emerged stronger and more purposeful. Family traditions emerged that celebrated their unity while honoring their past struggles. Sunday dinners became a time for sharing stories of resilience, with Sister Margaret often joining them. Holidays included special remembrances of Thomas Carter, whose sacrifice had ultimately led to their family's formation. The shelter remained a central part of their lives, with all family members regularly volunteering. Jacob's experience as both a CEO and a homeless man brought unique insight to program development. Emily's professional expertise helped secure sustainable funding. The children's presence reminded everyone that recovery and success were possible. Their story became a source of hope for others facing corporate retaliation. Emily and Jacob frequently spoke at conferences and universities, sharing their experience while advocating for continued reform. Their family's journey from victims to victors inspired others to stand against corruption. Sarah's artistic talents flourished under the guidance of local artists who had supported them during their struggles. Her exhibitions of family-themed artwork attracted attention from galleries and critics, but she remained focused on using her art to help other children process trauma and celebrate healing. Michael's academic achievements reflected his determination to understand the systems that had nearly destroyed his family. His middle school graduation speech about justice and perseverance brought tears to the eyes of teachers who had once doubted him. His path to becoming a corporate ethics lawyer seemed clear. Jacob found peace in mentoring other business leaders about ethical practices and corporate responsibility. His unique perspective, having experienced both extreme success and complete loss, made him a powerful advocate for reform. His relationship with his own children from his previous marriage began to heal as they witnessed his transformation. Emily's work expanded beyond the foundation to include advising government agencies on protecting vulnerable families from corporate retaliation. Her father's legacy lived on through her efforts to ensure that no other family would face destruction for exposing corruption. The community that had rallied around them during their darkest hours remained steadfast allies in their continued advocacy work. Their home became a gathering place for strategy sessions, support group meetings, and celebrations of victories in the ongoing fight for corporate accountability. Their family's strength came not just from overcoming adversity, but from using their experience to create lasting change. Each member found their own way to contribute to their shared mission of protecting others while maintaining the tight bonds that had helped them survive. 5 years after Sterling's final sentencing, Jacob stood at a podium in the newly constructed Carter Community Center. The building, funded by settlement money and community donations, represented everything they had fought to achieve. Looking out at the packed auditorium, he saw the faces of those who had shared their journey: Sister Margaret, Detective Thompson, fellow advocates, and countless families they had helped along the way. Emily sat in the front row, holding Sarah's hand, while Michael fidgeted with his tie, a miniature version of Jacob's. Their family had become a symbol of resilience, but more importantly, they had become whole. The adoption certificates hanging in their home office were merely formal recognition of what they had known all along: family isn't just about blood, but about standing together through life's darkest storms. The center's programs reflected their collective vision: a legal clinic for corporate whistleblowers, art therapy sessions for traumatized children, job training for the homeless, and advocacy workshops for social justice. Each element grew from their personal experience, transformed into tools for helping others. The shelter where their story began now operated as a satellite facility, with Sister Margaret training new staff in her approach to comprehensive family support. Sarah, now a talented teenage artist, had her work permanently displayed in the center's gallery. Her pieces told their family's story alongside those of other survivors, creating a powerful narrative of transformation and hope. Michael, heading to high school with dreams of law school, spent afternoons helping younger children with mathematics and sharing his own story of overcoming adversity. Emily's leadership of the foundation had revolutionized corporate social responsibility in their city. Her programs, focusing on ethical business practices and family support, became models for organizations nationwide. The Thomas Carter Memorial Scholarship, established in her father's honor, helped children from families affected by corporate corruption pursue their educational dreams. Their home remained a haven, not just for their family but for others seeking courage to fight injustice. Weekly dinner discussions often included visitors sharing similar struggles, finding hope in their story of triumph over systematic corruption. The dining room table, where they had once plotted their survival, now served as a place of healing and strategy for others. Jacob's journey from corporate success through homelessness to redemption became required reading in business ethics courses. His experiences informed new corporate governance standards, while his continued advocacy ensured that ethical business practices remained at the forefront of public discourse. The restoration of his reputation mattered less to him than the impact of his story on corporate culture. The children's resilience inspired educational programs about corporate accountability and social justice. Michael's school initiatives on ethical leadership attracted national attention, while Sarah's art therapy programs helped other children process their experiences with corporate retaliation. Their personal healing became a catalyst for broader social change. Detective Thompson's investigation methods were now taught at the FBI Academy, her meticulous approach to exposing corporate corruption becoming standard procedure. The networks of support and evidence gathering she had established continued to protect vulnerable families from systematic harassment. Sister Margaret's expanded shelter network, supported by the center's resources, helped countless families rebuild their lives. Her vision of combining practical support with advocacy for justice transformed how communities addressed homelessness and corporate accountability. The shelter where Jacob had first helped Emily's family became a symbol of hope and renewal. Their story continued to evolve, touching new lives and inspiring further change. Each small victory, a family finding housing, a whistleblower protected, a corporation choosing ethics over profit, added to their legacy of transformation. The darkness that had once threatened to destroy them had become the foundation for building a more just and compassionate community. As Jacob concluded his speech at the center's opening, he looked at his family, not just Emily and the children, but the extended community they had built. Their triumph wasn't just about surviving Sterling's revenge or exposing corporate corruption. It was about proving that love, justice, and determination could transform personal tragedy into collective hope. The center stood as a testament to their beliefs that every person deserves dignity, that families can be forged in adversity, and that standing together against injustice creates unbreakable bonds. Their story, once a cautionary tale of corporate revenge, had become a beacon of hope for others facing similar battles. What began as a chance encounter between a homeless former CEO and a desperate mother had grown into a movement for corporate accountability and social justice. Their family's healing became a model for community transformation, proving that the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures when people stand together for what's right. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey of redemption and justice. Your support means everything to our team. If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing it with friends and family who might find hope in Jacob's journey. Don't forget to like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonated with you. Should we continue exploring what happens next in Jacob and Emily's story? Let us know if you'd like to see part 2 of The Homeless Millionaire.